Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Snorra. It's very nice to be in this wonderful bookshop. And as Snorra said, my name is Will Mawhood. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience learning Latvian as a foreigner, specifically as a Brit. Labvakar visiem, paldies, Snorra. Ir liels prieks būt šeit, šajā brīnišķīgajā grāmatnīcā, un mani sauc Will Mawhoods, un es parunāšu mazliet par savu pieredzi, kā ārzemniekiem, kas ir daudz maz iemācījies latviešu valodu. I should ask first of all, is there anyone who doesn't speak any Latvian at all? Yep. Vai ir kāds šeit, kas nerunā labi angliski? Is there anyone who doesn't speak English well? I guess not. Okay. What I said, if people didn't understand, is just my introduction, but I have to prove first I can speak a little bit of Latvian, I guess. So, having demonstrated that, why did I learn Latvian? Why am I here? A lot of people seem to think I have some sort of family connection to Latvian. A lot of foreigners do. Maybe because I have a slightly unusual surname, but not the case. I'm from England, and most of my family are English or Irish background. So what is the connection? When I was teaching here in a language school, I remember we once got a CV from someone applying for a job in Riga who said in their CV, I have always been fascinated by Latvian culture. And this was a guy, if I remember correctly, who was British and in his early 20s and was teaching in China at the time. I remember thinking, okay, that's very confident, very ambitious, but I'm not sure I completely believe you. So I wish I could say the same thing, that I'd always been fascinated by Latvian culture, but that would be untrue. I do think I knew what the capital of Latvia was, so I was always quite good at geography. So I knew Riga, approximately. But basically, my connection with this part of the world starts with this. So we can have a quick geography test. Can anyone tell me this country?
Estonia.
Beautiful, our lovely northern neighbours. Wait, you mean this is not the flag of this country? Oh dear. Terrible Latvian translator I am. No, this is the flag of our lovely northern neighbours, Estonia. I spent a year teaching English in Tallinn. I was offered a job there in a Russian school, actually. And as not much was happening interesting in my life in England, I decided to go along, and I had, in many ways, quite a challenging but also fascinating year, and it kind of sparked an interest in the Baltics, which I definitely still have quite a long time later. But as I said, it was a Russian school. They offered me free courses in Russian, which I did for a couple of months and tried to get to grips with the Cyrillic alphabet and all the other mysteries of Russian. And then after a couple of months, I started going out with an Estonian girl, a native speaker of Estonian, who, when she found out that I was learning Russian and not learning Estonian, made her thoughts clear on this, that this was not really an acceptable thing for a foreigner to be doing. And I thought a bit about it, and I decided in the end I cared a bit more about what she thought than what my largely Russian colleagues thought. So I changed to learning Estonian, which unfortunately the school didn't provide me with free Estonian lessons, so I was kind of teaching myself. Has anyone here learned Estonian or tried to learn Estonian? Okay, I'm not surprised. Anyone else? Anyone else who's not like a hardcore polyglot? No, okay. Don't ever try to learn Estonian. Lovely country, fascinating people, fascinating culture, but bloody hell. So I was doing this kind of in a very chaotic way, and by the end of the year, after maybe 4 or 5 months when I left Estonia, I could probably have had a conversation with a child's, if it was an unusually stupid child who couldn't talk about very much. And as it happened, my girlfriend, who I mentioned at the time, had a brother who was much younger than her, must have been about 15 years younger than her. So he was sort of 6 or 7. And I could talk to him when we went to her parents' house because he would mostly just talk about pirates. So I can still remember Piratid elab laivas, which means pirates live in a boat, which I think, as we all know, is the case. So I can talk about pirates in Estonian if it's very simple pirate activity. But, as I said, at the end of the year, I left Estonia. I was offered a job down here in lovely Latvia. And when I arrived, I was quite highly motivated, much more, I would say, than most foreigners arriving in Latvia with no heritage or connection to Latvia. Basically because I'd learnt enough Estonian that I could sort of communicate at a very, very low level, as I've explained. But if you are British, is anyone else here British? Or American? Or 3? Wow. American, okay. I think, to be honest, any native English speaker would count here. So we've got British, American, you said British as well?
American.
Sorry for pointing at you like this. Identify yourself. 2 Americans and 1 Brit. Any other native English speakers? No? No, you're not sure?
I speak Spanish, but I speak English.
Right, okay. So your first language is Spanish, but
Yes.
or you speak both languages natively?
Just English, yes.
Just English, I see. Okay, so we've got a few. I'm sure Mexicans is different because you can handle different languages. I can say as a Brit, and I think this would also apply to Americans, I think a lot of us, including myself, I was never very good at languages at school, view speaking a foreign language as a kind of superpower. It's something that is sort of beyond what the human mind is normally capable of. Even though we're kind of aware that most of the rest of the world can speak multiple languages, we don't really believe it's possible for people like us to do it. And I do remember the experience in Estonia of opening my mouth and these peculiar sounds coming out and people responding as though these sounds meant something. And this to me was amazing. I'd done a bit of French before, but I never really spoke to actual French people. I would just speak to my French teacher who didn't like me and looked disapproving whatever I said. So this was really quite a kind of thrill. So I was very motivated to learn Latvian when I came down here. And I immediately bought a couple of textbooks, it was at the time. There weren't really, at that time, kind of apps or any of these kind of things for learning. And
What year is this? I'm sorry.
this was, let me think, 2012 or 2013. I think 2013. You're taking notes. On, making me feel quite paranoid. Okay. I think 2013. I will confirm my biography with you later. Have to think. On the first few pages, it may have been on page 3 or 4. I remember being confronted with this, something very similar to this. I'm guessing at least some people here probably are learning Latvian.
I'm Latvian.
You are Latvian,
I'm a
okay.
Latvian teacher. But
You're a Latvian teacher, okay.
Yeah.
So, right, you're not learning Latvian then? Could you put up your hand if you're learning Latvian? Okay. Several people, all right. Can anyone recognise what this is? Can anyone explain?
So the cases, I'm like, this is the word this.
Yes,
in all the
good.
cases.
Yeah, exactly. It is not just this, but also that. You're right. So shis is this, tas would be that, and then it's also the plural form. So these and those. So this is the case system, because Latvian has a case system, and it is all of the possible forms for the words that in English would be indicated by this, that, these, those. So that's 4 words. And you can see that in Latvian, this is, I haven't actually counted them, I'm guessing around 30 possible forms. So even though I'd done a little bit of Estonian, and the Estonian case system is even more complicated, I hadn't really encountered it presented in this way. This is, I think, to the average English speaker, English, I'm guessing most people know, does not really have a case system. It does to a very, very limited extent for pronouns. So he and him, for example, would be an example. He gave me a book. I gave a book to him because him is the accusative form, so we have a different form. Most English speakers, native English speakers, I think, would not even conceive of it in that way. They wouldn't think about it because it is so unusual in English to have a case system where the endings will change to indicate the relationship in the sentence. So in Latvian, if people aren't aware, this happens for basically every noun. So if you want to say, for example, vehicles, shop, where we are now, you wanted to say, I'm going to the shop, S-A was vehicolo. So the ending will change to a U because it's in the accusative form. And this can happen, as we can see, in very many different forms. So this, for someone who is coming to it from a language that doesn't have a case system, and even the remnants of a case system that exist in English are kind of disappearing, which we can talk about in just a second. This is a bit like buying a book called like Maths for Dummies or something because you want to do your tax return and being presented with quantum mechanics on page 5. It's like not just something that is difficult, but something that is literally in a kind of different reality from what you're able to conceive at this point. I'm not saying, by the way, that Latvians shouldn't do this. I can't think of another way to introduce it. I'm just saying it is terrifying, and I'm amazed I think I did scream, but I continued after screaming. So there you go, I'm here now. So I said previously, this is a bit of a diversion, but maybe interesting, especially for people who maybe don't speak English natively. English did have a case system, I believe, historically. I think if you go back a very long way, 1,000 years or so, English had a case system that wasn't that different from Latvian, would have probably been more similar to German. For various reasons that stopped existing for most words, I think mostly from the influence of other languages, especially in England. And it is still degrading now, it's still continuing to disappear. So I can demonstrate this, I hope. Oh dear. Sorry, I tried to make the text more interesting because I thought the text was all very boring. But it doesn't, this font doesn't seem to be able to cope with Latvian characters. I apologise. Can people read that? Especially, sorry, madam, you said you're Latvian?
Yes, I'm Latvian teacher.
You're a Latvian teacher.
Of course I can read.
You can still read that even though it's horribly mangled. Okay,
It's just split it in...
yes, I'm sorry about that.
Okay.
Would you be able to translate that for me?
With whom did you talk?
Okay, so that's interesting how you translated it, and I'm guessing probably about 95% of Latvians would translate it like that.
Yeah,
with,
I did it
with whom did you talk? You are actually completely correct, and most native speakers would be incorrect, technically, how they translate this. Would anyone who is a native speaker tell me if with whom did you talk sounds natural in English? No? Okay, you're shaking your head.
No.
What would you say if you were just in conversation?
Who did you talk with?
Who did you talk with? Yeah, or who did you talk to, perhaps, yeah. So this is something I notice with not just most Latvians, but most people who speak a language that does have a case system, is that they use whom, which is completely correct, because whom is the accusative form of who. However, I would say 95% or above of native English speakers, I think this is true in America as well, but certainly in Britain, don't use whom in most situations, apart from maybe with a preposition. You might say to whom or with whom. But in most cases, I would say who did you speak to, which is actually not correct, because who in this case is in the accusative form. It's receiving the speaking, so to speak. So this just goes to show that actually the case system is kind of disappearing in English, because most people in the UK know that there is a form, whom, but most people don't really know how to use it properly. And it's almost become a bit of a joke that educated people know how to use whom. And some people seem to believe that who is always wrong, and you always have to say whom, which is a very strange thing, because obviously who is the nominative form, and that is correct sometimes. But it's almost become a kind of joke, where if you want to sound intelligent, you can just say, whom are you? Which is, I mean, that doesn't sound intelligent, that sounds stupid, but I can't think of a better example right now, which is completely wrong, okay? Because whom in that form is not the accusative form, it's the nominative form. But it's not really natural to people anymore, I think, native speakers. So actually, when I'm working with clients, in most situations, if they use whom correctly, which most of the time Latvians do, I tend to advise them not to do it, because it tends to sound very formal and sometimes even a bit pedantic. So it depends on the context, it depends on your audience. But it's very interesting that it's a case where Latvians actually speak a lot more correctly than I would say the majority of English people, including quite educated English people and Americans, Australians, etc. Okay, that's a little bit of a diversion, but we will come back to the case system because I think it's quite important about how Latvian works in a different way from English. Vocabulary now, because I continued in my book after screaming, and I was taught important words to know in Latvian. I remember in one of these textbooks there were the first 10 verbs to start with in Latvian. One of which I was slightly surprised was, can anyone tell me what this is in English or in Latvian, this activity?
What?
Fantastic, yeah. Orgot. How would that be in
Picking
English?
berries.
Picking berries, absolutely. Yeah. So, among the 10 first words that a person learning Latvian must know, before, if I remember correctly, this was before strādāt, which means to work.
First things first.
I may be wrong, but certainly before a lot of very important verbs. Orgot, also sēņot, which means, anyone?
To pick mushrooms.
To pick mushrooms, absolutely. This to me seemed bizarre because I don't think to pick mushrooms or to pick berries would be in the first 10 or even probably the first 10,000 verbs in English because there isn't even a dedicated verb for them, you would say, to pick mushrooms, to pick berries. But as I quickly realised, this is what Latvians do, certainly in preference to most other activities. So to a Latvian explaining their language to the outside world, this is indeed one of the 10 most important words you need to know. This is also actually an interesting characteristic of Latvian, I think, in comparison to English, certainly with British English, is the much greater connection and variety of words connected to nature. That's something I've really noticed, which we'll come back to a little bit later, I hope. So, after persevering and learning a few more words than orgot and sēņot, which took me a certain amount of the way, but you do need more than that. Even to talk to Latvians, you can't always talk about picking berries, picking mushrooms. After a couple of years, I got to a point where I could have, conversations, and a few years after that, I actually started translating. And I started thinking a little bit about my general impressions of Latvian as a language. And as I said, the case system struck me as being very strange, very confusing. After a while, I realised actually there's a lot of other languages like that. In some ways, English is quite unusual. But one thing that I started to realise when I built up my vocabulary a little bit was something that seemed quite strange and even quite funny to me about how Latvian words were constructed. So this would be an example. This was one of the ones that I noticed first. The picture is quite a big clue, but could anyone translate this for me? Any of them? Suspicious, fantastic. Yeah. Aizdomīgs is suspicious. Aizdomāt would be the verb, which would be to suspect, to be suspicious. So this word can be broken down into two parts. So there's aiz first, which means behind, and domīgs, which is thoughtful, I suppose, thoughtful or thinking, maybe. So it took me a while to realise this, but literally it is saying if you're suspicious, you are behind thinking or behind thoughtful, which I thought was kind of a nice way of expressing this, because I suppose in a sense, if you're suspicious, you are kind of, I don't know. It made sense to me, and I remember thinking that's very funny, that's very amusing. We don't have words like that in English. But I started to realise that there are quite a lot of other words that are structured in that way, not just adjectives, but it's relatively common, something that I've noticed in many forms where Latvian seems to be more literal to me than English. I'll just give a couple more examples now, and maybe later other people would have ideas. Priekšnesums would be another example, which means, anyone translate that?
Kind of show.
Yeah, I would think of a performance, right? But literally, that would be priekš.
Yeah, something what you bring in front of others.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very, so nesums would be carrying or bringing, and priekš has a kind of in front of or forward meaning. So literally bringing something in front of you, I suppose, for a performance. So I thought, very nice, very funny. it reminded me a little bit of German, which I did a little bit of at school, and I always found it very amusing, for example, in German, that glove. Does anyone know how to say glove in German?
Handschuhe.
Handschuh, exactly. Handschuh, which probably you can understand even if you don't speak German. A shoe for your hand, which is precisely what it is. I think in England we have a stereotype about Germans being very kind of efficient and logical, and that struck me as being wonderfully logical. Yes, it is a shoe for your hand. So I thought of Latvian as having that kind of characteristic. When I was putting this together, I found another example, which is izdzīvot. Izdzīvot meaning to survive. It could also mean to outlive. But izdzīvot avāriju, for example, to survive an accident, which would also break down in the same way. Anyone who's learning Latvian, could you explain the different parts of izdzīvot?
So dzīvot is to live.
Yep.
And
exactly.
is would be like beyond something. Or?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these prefixes they could have different meanings, but is could mean out or through in different contexts. Yeah, so it's kind of literally to outlive, which you can say in English. You can say to outlive something, but the meaning is a little bit different. It doesn't quite mean survive. You can outlive someone else, perhaps, but you wouldn't outlive an accident. So I thought, oh, that's kind of amusing. That's another case of Latvian being very literal. And then I thought a little bit more about it, and I realised survive, actually, if you think about the etymology, it has the same meaning, because it comes originally from French. Like a lot of words in English, English being a rather strange Germanic language, where, because of the history of England, where in 1066 England is invaded by the Normans from northern France, and thereafter the language basically of the aristocracy is French, and for several hundred years in England, actually most of the people at the top don't really speak English. And then in many parts of Europe, including Latvia, this continued until the 20th century, where the aristocracy and the common people basically spoke different languages. For some reason, that didn't happen in English in England. In England, the aristocracy eventually started speaking English, or maybe more accurately, the two languages kind of merged. So this is why English is such a strange Germanic language, and maybe why German and Dutch and these other languages seem so literal to native English speakers, because the roots are basically Anglo-Saxon, so Germanic. Most of the most common words are Germanic, but most of the more literary or descriptive or technical language is Latinate, is from French or from other related languages, including survive. So survive comes from, I assume, comes from the French, which would be sur, so like above, and then vivre, to live. So actually the meaning is exactly the same in English. But because most English speakers don't speak French, I think we sort of expect not to literally understand the meaning of words in the very literal way that speakers of other Germanic languages, and I think also speakers of a lot of Baltic languages, do. So even though survive has the same meaning literally as izdzīvot, we don't see that, or we have to think a little bit about that. So I found that kind of interesting. We have this like distance from our language in some ways because of its history. Not sure how clearly I've explained that, but I can certainly talk a little bit more when there are questions, which we'll stop in a few minutes, and I'll ask if people have any thoughts about this. So, working as a translator, which I've been doing for the last few years, starting with Latvian, and then I've increasingly been working as well with Latgalian, which is big debate whether that is a form of Latvian or not, but if you have opinions about this, please keep them to yourself. This will take a very long time. Happy to talk to you in another venue at another time. But anyway, Latvian and Latgalian. One thing I really notice about Latvian in comparison to English is, well, maybe we can demonstrate in the next slide. So could anyone, one of our Latvians or one of our non-Latvians, translate this? If we say, for example, runa ir par angļu valodu,
speech is about the English language.
It could mean that.
Yeah.
It could mean that, yes, but it could also mean something.
Conversation is about.
Conversation.
The conversation is about English, yes. It could also
Or the
mean.
theme is
Yeah.
where we are discussing, yes.
So, how I would translate this, and I have to say, I haven't double checked this with a native speaker, so if this is completely wrong, I do apologise, but I don't think it is. I've noticed this quite often in translation. Runa ir would be idiomatically best translated as what we are talking about is.
Yeah.
So you could say that in conversation, Runa ir par angļu valodu, piemēram. So what we're talking about is English. And that was translated as the speech is about, yes, because it could also be about someone giving a speech at a wedding or something. And this is something I really notice in English compared to Latvian, is how messy it is. English is incredibly messy, and you need all of these pointless words, grammatically pointless words, like what we are talking about. In Latvian, the speech, which could mean the conversation, is about. We can think of other examples. If you wanted to say, for example, least ara, which thankfully it isn't right now. Could anyone translate that?
It's raining outside.
It's raining. Your Latvian is very good.
Thank
It's raining outside, absolutely. But in Latvian, if you translate that word for word, raining outside. In English, you need to have what is called a dummy pronoun, which is basically a pronoun that actually means nothing at all, which is it. Never really thought about this before because it's my native language, and probably most people, unless they've learned a very different foreign language, just don't think about these things. It is raining. What does it mean in that context? Everything, reality, the weather? I don't know. But in Latvian, you don't need to say that, just raining outside. And this has certain effects. It firstly makes me feel like I'm getting shortchanged, because basically if I translate a text into English, it will invariably be 20% to 25% longer, I would say. Invariably, it's in that field. And I kind of feel like I'm producing extra value, even though that isn't the case, obviously. But I'm not being paid for that, because I get paid by the word in Latvian. So feel slightly annoyed about that.
You have to charge double.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. That's my plan, basically. And then I'll try to make it as wordy as possible in the English version. So unfortunately, we just need to have all of these descriptive words in. But that is actually true. You do often need, when you're translating, particularly translating stuff that is a bit more literary, for conversations in Latvian to sound in any way normal in English, you do sometimes need to add other words. Because Latvians, when they're talking to each other, they can be incredibly laconic and brief. You can hear conversations like, "Sliks laiks šodien." Yeah, ir. Which, is that something a Latvian could conceivably say to another Latvian?
I would say the shortest conversation among Latvians is no, kā ir.
Yeah, exactly. Okay.
That's it.
So my example was bad weather today. Yes, is, literally.
Yeah.
Which I don't think for Latvians to speak to each other like this wouldn't be taken as being unfriendly or being kind of passive aggressive necessarily. It's just you're conveying the information.
Normal.
Okay. I think if I translated that in a conversation between two people in, for example, a short story or something like this, it would seem, certainly to British readers, I think probably for other countries too who speak English natively, but I'm less confident saying that, as if one or both sides were quite angry. Because I think usually if you use very, very few words, especially if you just say, yes it is, in response to a question, you sound like you're quite angry with the other person, or like you're annoyed. And that is a complicated thing. When you have a sentence like that, you need to consider, should I put in extra words, which I think a British person would tend to do. Yes, it is, or in fact, I don't know how you continue that sentence, but you'd need to show some way that this person was not annoyed. Or do you translate it in that way literally and allow your readers to get the idea that maybe these people are annoyed with each other when they're not? It's quite a dilemma, I would say. I often find myself adding words like just, which is another example of a word that is a filler could I just have, I don't know, could I just have a glass of water? In that sentence, just has no meaning at all, but it's used to soften the statement, because could I have a glass of water to a British person sounds unreasonably aggressive. So you need to soften it even further. Could I just have a glass of water? So I find myself using certain words like this sometimes when I'm translating for Latvian to soften it slightly, although that's not always a perfect way. That's simply an example. So I'm going to demonstrate now something that I think illustrates a couple of points I was mentioning. Specifically about the use of the case system, the brevity of Latvian, not really about the connection with nature, but we can come back to that in a moment. Is there anyone here, apart from native speakers of Latvian maybe, who feel they understand Latvian well enough to translate this sentence? It is quite challenging, so I'm sure you do, Snorre. You can translate it into Norwegian, please.
Shall I do that?
If you'd like to, sure. It'd be interesting for us to hear a bit of Norwegian.
Først måtte jeg gå gjennom den gjennom gangen som var i et evig tussmørke, og i enden av dem på høyre side så var det et litt lysere rom med en høy disk.
Wow, Norwegian sounds a little bit different from what I was expecting. Okay, great. Well, we can talk about that a bit later maybe, but I would be curious in a second to ask if you have the same problem that I have with translating this. No, not at that level.
Yet, no.
So maybe we could go to our esteemed Latvian English teacher.
Well, sorry for my English, but I would say first of all we had to go through corridor which was always in never-ending twilight, at the end of which on the right side there was slightly lighter room with high counter.
Mm-hmm. Great, no, a very good translation. Yes, so I should say first, this is taken from my friend Vilas Kasims, who I've been very slowly translating some of his fiction. His very short stories, which are wonderful and often a little bit surreal. And this is from a story that will, I think, very soon be published in a journal in America. But this is difficult because essentially of this part for me. So absolutely, this would be, first of all, you had to go through, we'll forget about this because this is annoying, something at the end of which on the right side there was a slightly lighter room with a high counter. The problem is this part. So mūžīga means eternally. Krēsla means dusk or twilight, or actually in the dusk or in the twilight, because it's in the locative form, which you can express in just one word in Latvian, which you can't in English. Iegrimušam means sunk in, specifically, and then gaitanim would be corridor. So the problem here would be, first of all, you had to go through the eternally in twilight sunk corridor, which doesn't really sound right in English. And I thought a lot about how to say this. In the corridor, essentially what I decided in the end was this would just have to be in a different phrase. So first of all, you had to go through the corridor, which was eternally sunk in darkness or twilight or dusk, at the end of which is a slightly more awkward sentence than it is in Latvian. Because Latvian has this case system, you can simply stack up words and adjectives in a long line like this, so eternally in dusk, sunk corridor, and I've seen even longer examples. And a Latvian reading it, because of the endings, will know more or less immediately what that means, and they can kind of unpack it. And English, as I said before, is very messy. You can't do that. You need to indicate the relationships between words in different ways. You could use prepositions. You may have to think about the word order. Word order in Latvian is very free because of the endings actually it doesn't matter so much where a word is in a sentence because you can immediately see from the ending, generally, what its relationship is to the other words. You can't do that in English, so you usually need to have subject, verb, object. And that, again, restricts you. You can have these very neat sentences in Latvian that end up being, I don't know, 20 clauses long in English and sound horribly rambling, which they don't in Latvian. So that is a challenge. I realise I haven't spoken very much about the other thing I mentioned, which was the connection with nature, which I referred to. So I'll very quickly mention that and give a couple of examples, and then we can stop and have observations and questions if people have them. So this is definitely something that I noticed related to words such as I said, orgod, being given as one of the first 10 verbs that a speaker needs to learn. I think it made me realise, even as someone who grew up partly in the countryside, which I did for some of my life in England, how limited my vocabulary was connected to nature compared to the average Latvian, including quite young Latvians. It may be becoming less, but I'm not sure. The number of not just words but distinctions. So, for example, the word for forest would be mesh, but it seems to me there are quite a few other very specific words connected to forests or trees. Sils, for example, would be a pine forest, right? Not a pine tree, a pine forest.
Pine tree
right?
forest,
Yeah, exactly. I came across a word recently which was garsha, garsha with like a long A, which I'm not sure how much in use that is, but maybe that's a very archaic word, but that was described as like a deciduous forest, specifically. Okay.
Garsa, maybe.
Garsha may be the word I'm thinking of.
I would say virs.
Because garsha means taste, so I was confused by this, but it was with the macron. So
Yeah, there is such a word, yes.
Yeah, but very seldom used.
very seldom used.
Yeah.
Okay, well maybe even some of these distinctions are dying out a little bit in English. But with this example, which is maybe not the best example, but there are certainly other examples I could think of, what I found interesting was the level of distinctions that exist in English. That exist in Latvian, I'm sorry. In English there are certainly a lot of words for wood or forest. So I could think of forest obviously is a large wood. You have the word wood. Copse would also be I wouldn't say is very different from a wood, maybe a smaller wood. And then you have words like spinney, which sound quite literary, but basically also mean a wood. But those are just synonyms for the same thing, essentially. I don't think in English we have a word for example, a particular kind of forest. Maybe a word like a grove perhaps could be. I think that was traditionally associated with specific kinds of trees, but most people don't know that anymore. So I did find it interesting. You can see the history of Latvia. It is a much more, in some ways, a rural language, because I suppose until the 19th century, almost all Latvians were rural, and even after that, it's been much more connected with rural parts of Latvia than cities to an extent. But then also, generally, I do think the range of synonyms to me does seem to be greater in English, which may be again because of this history of different families, Germanic, Latin families kind of colliding in English. The vocabulary does seem to me to be bigger sometimes, even though often the words mean exactly the same thing, like the examples I gave. So I will stop there for a moment and I'll ask for questions or if anyone has observations or complaints. Yes?
It explains something that happened today, though. I was speaking Latvian at a shop and then she spoke Russian back at me and I'm like, why is she speaking Russian at me? So she probably thought I was a Russian person trying to speak Latvian and that's why I wasn't speaking well. And so she reciprocated with Russian. That's my guess now. It's like...
Well, there's an interesting phenomenon I've noticed. I noticed this recently in a completely different context. I think people who speak a relatively small language, if they come across someone who speaks their language quite badly, I don't want to say you speak badly, but with obvious limitations, they will default to any other language they speak that is like a bigger language, even if the person clearly doesn't understand it. Because I also had exactly the same experience, especially with older Latvians, especially after I moved to Liepāja, which would be the second part of my answer, how I got to a higher level. I moved out of Riga. and I lived in Liepāja for 3 years, and I found there I needed to use Latvian a lot more, and it's a kind of jumping in the deep end situation. You do have to pick it up eventually, or you don't drown or die. Maybe die emotionally, I don't know, because you can't speak to anyone. But at least 10 years ago, that was quite a different environment. But yes, especially in Liepāja, I found that older Latvian speakers, if I started talking to them in Latvian, they could obviously hear I had an accent, I was making a lot of mistakes. They would reply in Russian or sometimes in German as well. And even when the conversation continued and it was quite clear I didn't know what they were saying to them, and I'd said, "Es nerunāju krieviski, es nerunāju vāciski," they would just persist with speaking to me in Russian or German. And nothing I could say would convince them that it would be better to speak to me in Latvian. I didn't know what they were saying.
I learned Latvian in the 90s, so maybe it has changed because I have a different experience. So my problem was not that I was corrected, but the opposite, that I was not corrected at all. So people were like shocked that, oh, a foreigner speaking Latvian. And the problem was that I spoke with lots of mistakes, and I wasn't aware of that before later, but then I already had some degree of fluency in the language, and then it was very difficult to get rid of those mistakes later on because I had already developed my way of speaking and having fluency, but with mistakes because nobody cared to. Yeah, I was fossilized. So
can you remember any specific mistakes? It'd be interesting to.
Yeah, it was like wrong case or wrong ending for some of the case, like uz ogru, not uz ogri, for instance, which is a different declination, or
yes,
such things. So like correct case but wrong declination, or like or all kinds of things. So that maybe has changed, that people are now, they would like more to correct it, but I had not that experience at all, that people would correct me, and then I was very surprised when something I had said all the time and it was not correct. So, and nobody had corrected me. But that's maybe they wanted to be kind, or they was just happy that somebody tried to speak their language.
Yes, I haven't had the experience really of being corrected, although maybe sometimes it would have helped me. Definitely the experience of just like, what the hell are you doing? Not anymore. I think now when I speak to people, I think initially they sometimes maybe don't realise I'm not Latvian, but then as the conversation goes on, I think people will often say at a certain point, "Tu neesi Latvietis," like, you're not a Latvian. But I don't think they understand who I am or what I'm doing, because it's obvious I'm not Russian. But that's, I think for many Latvians, the only two categories of people who might speak Latvian, especially in, I don't live in Riga at the moment, I live in Kuldiga, so quite a rural part of Western Latvia. Especially in Kuldiga, I think there aren't even very many Russians in Kuldiga at all. So I think people find it confusing, but they eventually put me in a box which is just other. Like Latvians, Russians, very small category of other, and that, you know.
What about the difficult letters that we don't have in English, like the L and G and T? Those do you have any tricks for capturing the sounds? Because it seems like when you speak Latvian, you have a good accent. Like, you hear a lot of British people speak Latvian, it doesn't come out as smoothly, but yours comes out much more naturally with the rolling of the R's and all that.
So you're talking about, yes, so the one that I think is really unusual and quite interesting is the K with the cedilla. Yeah, exactly. So in places like Ķīpsala, for example, which is the island in the river, ķermenis, body, because that just, it's not a sound that exists in English. Ļa does. It would be in words like allure, for example. It doesn't exist at the beginning of a word. So that's maybe the difficulty. But I don't know. I think I decided at a certain point I wanted to improve my accent, because I didn't want to sound very, very much like a foreigner. I think I probably always will to a degree. I won't sound precisely like a Latvian, but I don't know. And I also felt in some ways, if you understand the sound of a language, you sort of understand in an odd way the speaker's experience of learning other languages. So for a while I would read a short text just to myself, like a paragraph or so, just in Latvian every day. And if you do this hundreds and hundreds of times, I think you find it becomes easier gradually to make these sounds, because one other thing I'd comment is my natural accent, which is like a fairly boring standard, what is called a standard British accent, basically how people speak in the south of England if you're fairly middle class. It is spoken kind of from the front of the mouth. I don't know if you find the same thing as an American or the other Americans present, but everything is spoken kind of from here. When I speak Latvian, everything comes from like back here. So I don't know if I can demonstrate. I need to think of something to say to.
You can read that.
Okay. Vispirms bija jāiziet cauri mūžīgā krēsla iegrimušam gaitenim, kura galā labājā puse bija mazliet gaišāka istaba ar augstu leti. So everything moves back, and it comes from somewhere here.
And your mouth's wider as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of. That's one of the first things I noticed when I heard people speaking Latvian. There's these long sounds, which is why I find it very strange that they always say. This will maybe be offensive to Latvians. Latvians always talk about Estonian being very slow, or maybe Estonians being slow, which I can understand. And it's funny to me because Estonian sounds like a fantastically quick language,
No,
like
we don't say
like
that
a bird.
Estonian language is slow.
The people, people is like,
That's a different story.
no, the people is like, I can see what you mean about the people being slow, but it was funny to me because Latvian actually, definitely some accents of Latvian sound incredibly slow.
Latvian is one of the slowest languages.
Yeah, but it's nice. I enjoy that quality, and also the musical quality which Latvian has, which everything always goes up and down. So I don't know, iela, like we're on avotu iela at the moment, like it does this, or uppe, like everything has this. It starts stressed and then it goes up, down, and then it goes up again if it can go up again. And my natural accent is incredibly monotonous because an English accent, it just doesn't have that musical quality. Some accents within Britain do. The Welsh accent, I don't know if people know what a Welsh accent sounds like.
Irish and Welsh.
Irish does
Irish,
a bit.
It's not as musical as Welsh though. Welsh is really up and down.
Welsh has this sort of, up and down, and I sometimes found it useful to think about that because also hanging on to words. So people in Wales will say things like, sorry, this is probably not very useful for people who don't have a concept of Wales, but the word I found useful trying to understand the Welsh accent was honey. So Welsh people would tend to say honey, which is in a way a bit more similar to how Latvian works, where you hang on to certain sounds and you
like a double letter or something.
You don't do that so much naturally in my native accent. Anyway. Yes.
So I would just like to expand on what you said about the accent, like the how you pronounce certain words. I think it's more important to, I have found it is more important to pay attention to the long vowels as opposed to the short ones. That's much, like for me, I just pronounce it all the same, and it makes a big difference, much bigger than how you pronounce those weird letters.
Motto.
Yeah, because there are also varieties of Latin where you don't have q and j. For instance, in Latgalian there's no q and j. So actually, many Latvians would also not pronounce them, and there are very few minimal pairs with these. But as you say, it's much more important with long and short vowels, because then the words really mean. But if you say kermenis instead of terminis, it doesn't mean something else. So
No.
it's less. It's important to sound correctly, but you wouldn't be misunderstood as you with kazas and kazas or something.
Yeah, but the Latgalians palatalize other sounds, don't they? So,
they
for example,
palatalize, but they
paldis
are-
is.
but they are not the same. So it's a soft K, but not ch, but it's ki.
Yeah. So they don't have the ch, but
So
they do.
Kermenis instead of kermenis.
Yeah. I was
I
thinking.
can't even hear it. I can't even hear the difference.
Yeah.
What you're doing there. That's part of the problem. It's like
I think so that
Kevinist, and it's like
that sound is. Can you do?
10 minutes. Yeah.
Very good, very good. Yeah, I think you need to make that sound, which, to be honest, if you're just aiming to communicate, I don't think you really need. I think there are very few sounds, very few words, if any, where a Latvian would not understand what you mean. But it is a sound that just doesn't exist in English, so you do actually need to kind of train. It's like if you're saying ch, but then you need to go up with your tongue and kind of press down.
Pushes,
Exactly. So that is just almost like learning a new exercise or something that you've never done before.
Actually, I can suggest some more tip and trick how to pronounce this ch, and you don't have to think that you have to palatalize K, but you can think that you have to palatalize T and say very, very soft consonant T, and that's how Russians make the same sound, and the result is anyway Ch. So even for my ears, in spite of the fact that I'm native Latvian and love my language very much, I think that the sound Ch is more close to T, not K.
I actually agree with that. I often see this written. Latvians, if they're trying to explain it to foreigners, will write that it's a palatalized K or K with a Y after it, and I think the sound is much more similar to T with a Y after it.
And the same is about G, like G-man. I would say it's much more close, not to soft G, not to palatalize G, but to palatalize D. Again, like Slavic languages, I would say.
I agree.
Not Dmitri, but Dima, so that's what we need.
Actually, also people from who speak Latgalian, originally they have sometimes a problem with ch. But in the Latgalian region, it's a bit more difficult for people to pronounce.
Yeah, they do not pronounce usually.
They have to learn when they want to speak like Latvian.
That's interesting because I've wondered. It's often not very easy for me to tell. I can certainly identify if someone is speaking Latgalian or if someone is speaking very heavily inflected, very heavily Latgalian inflected Latvian. But I don't know if it's always possible to tell Latgalians by their accents, or if most Latgalians could make the sound ch, for example. Like how.
Well, that's one sound by which you can try to catch it. That might be a Latgalian.
You can also mistake Lithuanians. They have like this Latgalian sounding accent. They speak Latvian with this mutual intelligibility between the.
Latgalian is kind of in between in a way,
Yeah, so you can also mistake Lithuanians for Latgalians sometimes. I have personally encountered that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because the Lithuanian accent in English, at least, is quite different. I can always hear if Latvian, as you were saying, sounds like a very kind of wide language. Lithuanian actually sounds very kind of pinched, and I'm not sure how well that describes it, but yeah.
I would say that when Lithuanians are talking Latvian, they sound like Russians who speak Latvian, and that is actually a problem of quite a lot of my Lithuanian students. They, when they try to speak Latvian, people often switch to Russian, and since they are young people, they say no.
Yeah, they're not very happy
Russian.
with that, I assume.
And people in the market and in shops still try to keep Russian conversation with them.
Interesting. Okay. If anyone has any more comments or questions, please ask. I've got a couple more points I wanted to make, and then a few ideas I've got about words that are hard to translate. But this is quite a chaotic presentation. So, I think one of the hardest things to learn, you can learn, as we said, the grammar, the vocabulary. That is all possible with enough effort. I think one thing that is really hard to learn is just what I would call collocations. So words that just happen to go together for no reason, just because native speakers have decided collectively that is naturally how these words go together. So I've got one example here that occurred to me very recently when I was doing a translation. So how would Latvian speakers here, how would you translate this phrase?
At the beginning of street, but of course it sounds ridiculous.
The beginning of the street? People agree?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So yes, it literally does mean this. So ielas is street in the genitive form, like of the street, and sākums is start or beginning. But in English, streets don't have starts. It's impossible to say the start of the street.
Yeah.
A street has an end and a street has another end, which I'd never thought about until recently. I had to, I think I was correcting actually the text translated into English, but I had the Latvian version. Someone wrote, at the start of the street, and something went off in my head and I thought, that sounds perfectly logical, but no, there's no start of the street. But then I thought, well, there must be a start of the street because... But there isn't. I thought about it. You always in
Like a
English refer
rainbow.
to the end of the street. I'm going to the end of the street. He was at one end of the street. I was at the other end. So there is no start of a street in English, including here. This is in Leeds, where I lived for some time in the north of England.
Oh, me too.
This is not a lovely place. Maybe not this part specifically,
No.
but has its nice areas. This is not the start of the street, this is the end of the street, and so is that end, which is out of sight. So I would say that is one of, again, these are things that are possible to learn with a lot of time and effort, but in a sense that's harder, I think, than even learning something like the case system, because that is a logical structure, and if you have a logical mind, eventually you can get your head around it. These things you only really notice when you come across them, like I did, where I just said to myself, the start of the street. Even though I've lived outside the UK for 15 years now, that just sounds intuitively wrong to me. And I think in Latvian you can say that, right? Ielas sākums, that doesn't sound weird.
We can, yeah, but
Ielas sākums and ielas gals.
to make even a bigger confusion for all of you, I can say that we have such a poetry book which is called Gals un Sākums, written by Rainis, which is our greatest poet. And Gals un Sākums actually means the last end and beginning. So that is even said vice versa.
The end and the start. Which doesn't sound. Does that sound deliberately strange in Latvian? I have come across that, but I'd never thought about it before.
This little bit poetic, I would say.
Interesting. Okay. How are people feeling?
How I
Exhausted or not exhausted?
No.
Good for you. That's the spirit. Yeah. Don't give in. Don't give up. Okay, so I'll give a couple of words.
Share those words would be interesting.
Share. Okay. So first one would maybe be the word would be tauta. I think it's very difficult to translate this into English.
Like
Nation.
Well, it's not difficult to find words that have the same meaning, but it is difficult to find words that English speakers, I think, would understand in the same way Latvians understand it. So, does everyone know what tauta means in the context of Latvian?
Well, different situations, different meanings.
Yeah, okay. Well, maybe you could explain a couple of the meanings it might have.
Folk, nation, people, these three would explain the majority of situations, I would say. I would say that the biggest confusion comes with tautu dēls and tautu meita. Like folk son and folk daughter, that is a little bit confusing.
I think that would be very hard. I think, as I said, actually the word in itself is confusing for native English speakers. Although I don't think Latvians always realise
Yeah,
that.
sorry for interrupting. There was also untranslatable concept like Latvia's tauta and Latviešu tauta, which
I agree.
Even kind of like two different meanings, but in English it really doesn't go into two.
Well, I'd say that the word itself is not clearly translatable because you can say folk, that word in itself has a very vague meaning in everyday English, as opposed to if you're a student of anthropology or nationalism or something like this. And also nation. Most native English speakers, I would say, would not clearly see a distinction between nation and country. You'll often hear people, I think to most people it means the same thing, whereas to people in many countries, I think, especially in Eastern Europe, there is a very clear distinction between nation, which has more of a cultural meaning, and country, which is a state. And there's very clear reasons for that, which is the history of Latvia and the history of many other surrounding countries, where it hasn't always been, the lines between the two have not always been clear. Whereas if you're from the UK, especially England, which is like the largest country within the UK and the historically dominant one, it's not very clear. Basically, I think we've never really had the need to have this word mean something. because of the history of England in particular, we haven't really gone through a traditional process of nationalism, as most countries in Europe have. I think in the US and also in Australia and other countries, apart from Ireland is the exception, but I think also in Ireland they don't clearly have this distinction. It's also a very different history because it's the states are not founded on this idea of a cultural, kind of original cultural people who need a homeland. They're much more of a melting pot in the case of the US. So I would say when Latvians say tauta, it is translatable as folk or nation. And I think often I've definitely seen texts where Latvians will write this, and I just don't think English speakers actually understand what that means. But then it's difficult without getting into very complicated conversations about nationalism and all these kind of things, which also often British people will misunderstand purely because of our quite unusual history of nationalism compared to some other countries. So I think that's a difficult one to convey.
I was going to say that now that you said that, it makes it a lot clearer. Like, to think in America we have this the word like Sioux Nation, like for the Native Americans, and to me that can kind of, it separates. It would work for that kind of meaning, I think, to call it Sioux Tauta, like this, like that's their nation, that's their group, and that kind of separates it. I like that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that, everything I'm saying about America, or basically any countries apart from Britain, I may be wrong. I'm sort of observing from a distance. So you're absolutely right, America does have this, you have kind of, indigenous people, which doesn't apply in the same way in the UK. I can definitely think of, cases in the UK, it would be quite common to hear the Prime Minister is addressing the nation. Does not clearly have a different meaning from the Prime Minister is addressing the country, to how most people hear it. The nation could mean the UK, which is actually for nations, strictly speaking, and people also understand that, but there's not the idea of the folk in the same way there are in many countries, and a lot of people would basically see it as very problematic, I would say, which is not a very informed opinion, but our understanding of this word folk in particular is very influenced by Nazi Germany. This is the context in which many people have heard it, and of course it is much more complicated than that. So I had tauta, that's a very complicated kind of conceptual one. The next one is a lot more simple one. I think it's just that there's not a good translation from it. Do people know the word torporsh?
Becoming.
Emerging.
Becoming future.
No. Your example was becoming...
Becoming or future.
Becoming or future, but how would you use that in a sentence in English?
No, well,
if I say, for example, torporša ēka, which you could say in Latvian, right? Like
building which will be
So
done.
Well, there you,
Building in progress.
Yeah.
building in progress sounds quite cool if you say building in progress, but it doesn't sound quite natural somehow. Your example, building which will be completed or which will be done. That kind of shows what I'm saying. You can't.
Well, actually, I imagine an example about some young specialists, like students of biology. I would say topošie biologi. So people who
biologists
become,
biologists. That also sounds very kind of impressive and poetic, but it doesn't sound very natural. And that's curious. I don't know why we don't have a word for this, but obviously
in arts, it's maybe emerging is a bit closer to that.
Again, I'm not saying necessarily there aren't translations. It's how you could use it in a sentence. So what would you say? How would you use that in an English sentence?
Like
emerging.
emerging artist.
Could you say torporš mākslinieks?
Well,
Wouldn't that mean like an artist who's who's training?
well, yeah, he's still in process of.
Yeah, I guess it could mean emerging, but.
by the way, we have to use definite ending, not indefinite.
Mhm.
Torporša is mākslinieks.
So using the definite, this is the one.
Yeah.
I see. Okay, well that's another thing. We don't have definite endings for adjectives. Excuse me. In English. I've got a couple more examples, and maybe other people have ideas. The next one I had was nest Latvias vārdu, or you could also use nest Rīgas vārdu. This phrase literally means to carry Latvia's name. I don't know if you've come across this, people who it's quite a common expression.
Yeah.
I find in Latvian. It's not that you can't express it, it's just that I can't imagine a situation where a British or American person would say that.
No.
Carry the name of America or carry the name of England
Because
to...
you don't have to do.
This
Very poetic.
this is exactly my point. This is why I think it's interesting. I think this is the mentality of quite a small country, where I think
So-
it's important to Latvians to tell the
Let me
world.
tell, on the same time when Snorre was starting to learn Latvian, I was singing in a youth choir Kammer, which is the best choir in the world still. And then this phrase was just like the most often hearable sound for us, because everywhere where we went to different choir competitions, always someone said, "Un šie jaunieši nes Latvijas vārdu pasaulē." So it literally means that we have to come with a sign Latvia, so learn this name. And that was almost physically bringing that name.
So carry the name of Latvia
Yeah.
basically into pasaulē, into the world.
Exactly.
But I mean, yeah.
Or sometimes in mountain climbing, like when somebody
Carry
like the
mountains.
flag.
Oh, sorry.
They want to mark their presence on the peak and put the flag. That's a bit this process of like, nest Latvijas vārdu pasaulē.
Yeah.
They carry some item to
Yeah.
mark the fact that they have been the first to mount the peak.
No, I've certainly come across it in many contexts. I think that would be good when a Latvian does something that is notable on the world stage.
Yeah.
But as I say, that the fact we don't have this phrase, or you can translate it, but it sounds rather strange to carry the name of whatever Britain, or even if you said Manchester. Manchester is quite a well-known city, but somewhere kind of obscure. I don't know.
Put it on the map or something.
You would say put it on the map, I'd suppose, yeah, which would sound more natural. But to carry the name somehow sounds more impressive and romantic.
Grandiose.
Absolutely, which I think it does say something. It's interesting that Latvia has this phrase, and I would imagine probably other smaller countries would have this expression.
Well, we
I
have
don't know
this
if is there an equivalent in Norwegian, for example, Snorre, or does everyone know about Norway? We don't need to.
I don't know, Tore, være Norges navn.
If so, that would be quite old. Like, or I don't.
You're also Norwegian.
also Norwegian.
I see.
It's not that usual at least, so it would be strange. But maybe, yeah, you know.
But like in Latvian also, I think maybe it's a bit already, but nowadays you wouldn't do it that much. Some years ago it would be kind of more popular.
Oh, right. So you think maybe Latvians have become more confident and they don't need to carry the name of Latvia anymore. They can put it down.
Well, I mean, to write something like that, like I wouldn't imagine writing this phrase anywhere, but maybe like...
But is that because you haven't done enough to carry Latvia's name into the world,
I mean,
maybe?
like maybe some 15 years ago there was a choir traveling and
I see.
they had this ambition to...
Maybe a little bit less, yeah. But still, when you read about some Elina Garanč, for example, who is singing all around the world, still there will be this phrase.
Yes. Also about the flow.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, in Spanish we do have it. We do say like poner el nombre en alto, to place the name on high, to the name of Mexico, or whatever.
Really? Okay, so you'd say that about Mexico. Would people say that about Spain as well, do you know? Or?
I don't think so.
You don't think so? Okay.
No.
So they're more
It's would be a little bit
more confidence, you think, in that?
Yeah. More of a
Ah.
Latin American thing, maybe.
Right.
So,
And do you think
smaller
that
countries.
comes from a similar place to...
Yeah. Like we matter. We're important. Look at us.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay, I'll give you one final example and then I think we should finish unless people have particular comments. So the final one is also connected to Latvia because it is vērtība, which means value, exactly, but Latvias vērtība in the sense that people often use it. So a value of Latvia, literally, which people will often say about things like, I don't know, they'll say, I was reading a text the other day about Jēkabpils, which is a town down the Daugava, and they were talking about the values of Jēkabpils being like the churches or the streets.
I would
So-
say that bagātība would be used instead of vērtība.
Treasure.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
In English, it would become just a point of interest.
Well,
Well,
this word in this context, Latvias-vērtība, or I've seen it used to mean so many different things, where it could mean so values in English, if you're using it in this sense, like the values of a place or the values of a community, maybe that more means like a moral quality.
yeah.
So my values are, I don't know, tolerance or whatever. And I see it used in Latvian and translated literally to mean a much broader thing. So people might say, they might talk about cultural practices being a vērtība. I don't know, like choir singing is a vērtība. These are maybe not the best examples, but
So like a heritage kind of thing?
I think there is no precise. It was almost like I was trying to think what would cover all of these things that are described as vērtība, and it's almost just like nice thing, like impressive thing. It's very, very, very broad how it's used.
But
it
always
seems
positive, yeah.
yes, yeah. So it could include my understanding of this word, like cultural practices, but also buildings or so on. But it's used quite a lot certainly in promotional campaigns for Latvia, and it just doesn't translate well into English. If you say Latvia, this is a value of Latvia, it doesn't. Again, that sounds like it's a moral quality, not a concrete thing or a practice, which is how people tend to use it. Okay, well that's everything from me. If people have any questions or comments, I'd be very interested to hear it. This has gone on a lot longer than I expected, but hopefully that meant people were interested and not that they just felt awkward and embarrassed. But because they were possibly Latvian, they had no way to express this, so they just had to stay here. Thank you very much. Paldies.